Mhm. Well, it's okay.
Hello and welcome to the inaugural webinar from the Woods Hole Research Center. We are trying out this new platform to share our science with our interested audience, so thank you very much for joining us today. Today we're going to speak about the Amazon fires and the science behind what's going on in Brazil and the rest of the Amazon. My name is Dave McGlinchey. I am the Senior Director here for Communications and Government Relations. I'll be moderating the event and fielding your questions. For people joining us, if you could look to the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. As our speakers introduce themselves and give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, you can submit questions through the Q&A function. We'll receive them, and then I will hand them off to the appropriate scientists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. On my right here, I have Dr. Michael Coe, who is the director of our Amazon program. Mike has a long career studying the Amazon, studying the interaction between agriculture and rainforest there, and many of you may have seen him last night on PBS NewsHour. He did a great special on the threat of deforestation to the Amazon and the interaction with agriculture. So I encourage you to look that up and watch it. We'll also be sharing it on our social media pages. Coming to us from Brazil, we have Dr. Annie Alencar, the Director of Science for EPAM, the Amazon Environmental Research Institute, a long-standing partner of the Woods Hole Research Center, doing incredible work in the Amazon, and we're so glad that she's able to join us. And next to her, we have Dr. Paulo Brando, who holds positions with the Woods Hole Research Center and also EPAM. Dr. Brando testified yesterday morning to the Brazilian Congress about what can be done and how we can avoid fires like we've had this year in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Coe. He's going to speak briefly, kind of give an overview of the topic, and we're going to hand it off to Brazil to hear from our guests there, and then we'll open the floor up to questions.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I guess the question is, why is the Amazon important to us and the rest of the planet? And the short answer to that really is that forests are a huge part of the climate system. There's really two ways that forests shape the climate. One of those is through carbon. Talk about that a lot. Almost all the carbon stored on the land is in forests, and the vast majority of that is in tropical forests. And the Amazon is 1/2 of all tropical rainforests on the planet. So there's a lot of carbon already stored in the Amazon, something like equivalent to 10 years of global carbon emissions are stored in the Amazon. The other thing that forests do with carbon is they remove it from the atmosphere. They don't just store it, but they're pulling it out at all times. Something like 30% of all carbon emitted by humans on the planet is being pulled out by forests. And most of that, again, is the tropics, and again, the Amazon is half of that. Another point about forests is it's not just about the carbon, it's also essentially they're giant air conditioners. What they do is while they photosynthesize, they're taking water out of the soil and they're taking sunlight, and they're turning that into water vapor. And in about 2/3 of all sunlight and rainfall are converted back to water vapor by tropical forests. So that process cools the land surface. If you remove the forest, you heat it up immediately, something like 5 degrees C or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we deforest a chunk of land in Brazil today, tomorrow it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And that's permanent if you are putting something else in place. In addition, that water vapor creates rainfall locally and thousands of miles away. And of course, that supports agriculture, urban water supplies, biodiversity, and a host of things that humans and animals and plants need water for. Therefore, continued deforestation is leading to runaway climate change, more frequent crop failures in Brazil, and even greater economic uncertainty globally as these problems cascade outward. Summing up there, forests then are really not just responding to climate, but they're actually creating. So what is the importance of these fires that we're seeing over the last few weeks? Ani and Paulo are going to talk a great deal about that in a moment, but what the fires are really, what we're seeing now is it means we're heading in the wrong direction. Land is being deforested, the trees are being stacked up and burned, the fires are escaping into forest that wasn't deforested and destroying those. So recent numbers show that something like 7,000 square kilometers of land were deforested in Brazil this season alone. That's something like 2 times the size of Rhode Island. That's the land that's burning. What we're not entirely sure yet is how much of the forest, maybe we'll get to that a little bit, how much of the existing forest that is burning in addition to the land that's been deforested. But what we do know is that a substantial amount of CO2 is being released. Maybe as much as 140 million metric tons of CO2 will be emitted from to the atmosphere from these fires that we're seeing. So these fires are showing us where deforestation is taking place, and it's converting those forests to CO2 almost immediately. So what do we do now? As I was mentioning, tropical forests really are the only large-scale tool available to us, one of the only tools available to us to avoid and mitigate global climate change. They remove CO2 from the atmosphere and they cool the land directly. But keeping those forests standing or restoring them where we can is really the simplest and cheapest mechanism to avoid catastrophic climate change and mitigate the impacts of ongoing change. Something like 20% of the Amazon has already been deforested. We really can't afford to lose more. What we need to do is redouble our efforts to end deforestation. One of the things that's important to get to that ending deforestation is understanding who is doing deforestation. Because once you know who, you can come up with personalized ways to help them end deforestation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. All right, we're going to hand it over to Brazil. Dr. Alencar, if you could start maybe by telling us about the relationships between deforestation and the fires that we're seeing in the Amazon.
Thanks, Dave. So we at IPAM, in partnership with Woods Hole, have been working with this fire issue in the Amazon for the past 25 years. And something that is very interesting is that most of our work has been focusing on the relationship between deforestation and the susceptibility of the standing forest to fires, to forest fires. So this reveals a lot to us in terms of how fire occurs in an environment that is not actually, how can I say, adapted to fire. So the Amazon forest is an ecosystem where fire is rare in the landscape. So it's not like other ecosystems that you have there, for example, in California or in Florida, where fire is part of the ecology of the landscape. And I'm not going to talk about that because I have Paulo Brando here by my side, which is a specialist on this. But I'm just going to talk about the relationship between human use of the land and fire. So in '95, we conducted together with Woods Hole a big study to understand how is the use of fire in the Amazon. And that we interviewed several producers at that time. We also we used remote sensing to map their properties in terms of which type of fires they were catching in those properties. And the main results of that study indicated that 50% of the area burned was accidental. Basically, didn't have to happen, you know. And just, I don't know if everyone is aware of all the types of fire that exist in the Amazon, but maybe it should be important to explain a little bit that. So when you talk about fire in the Amazon, we are talking mostly about deforestation fires. Basically, is the fire that happens as the last stage of the process of deforestation, which begins with the cut of the forest. So they cut all the forest, let it dry for a period of 1 to 3 months, depending on the time, the length of the dry season, depending on the area in the Amazon that this forest was cut. But in general, it's like that. So people cut the forest, take out all of the trees. The trees are piled there and let it to dry for 1 to 3 months in average. And then they burn. So this is like how deforestation fires occur. And this usually is the majority of the fires in the region. Also, there are the maintenance fires, which are the fires that people once one pasture area, pasture field, or old agricultural field was established a long time ago. People sometimes want to clean this area, and we call that clean. I don't know. So they set fires as to maintain the area. So it's like a maintenance fire. This is also a common fire in the Amazon, but it's not as common as the deforestation fires. Then we have the forest fires, which are rare, should be rare, because the Amazon resists to fire in a certain point of view. We are changing that, but Paulo is going to explain that. So the forest fires, they are common. They are becoming common, more common in the Amazon, because humans are changing. We are changing the way that the forest acts as a barrier to fire. And also because we are changing we have a lot of influence on the climate, as Mike explained. So climate change and local climate change has influencing the susceptibility of the forest to spread fires. So this would be the third type of fire. And we have a fourth, we always would like to talk about a fourth type, which is the fire that escape from deforestation fires and also from maintenance fires and escape to other agricultural areas. So having that in mind, we every year at IPAM, we how can I say, we track how hot pixels are increasing along the year, because this is how we like to do. We like to study fire, isn't it, Paulo? This year, something called our attention. We had a peak of fire hotspots in mid-August, and that is very uncommon. Is that peak, something like that peak we had in 2010, when we had one of the worst droughts in my period of life that the Amazon faced. So something else was happening. And then we remembered that in the beginning of July, we had that major issue related to the spike of deforestation that was pointed out by INPE, which is our National Institute of Spatial Research, and they are they give the official numbers of deforestation, and they were presenting a number of alerts, in deforestation alerts, and how they were increasing a lot from if compared to last year. And there was a lot of commotion to that. And basically, that was a prediction that we would have a high fire season this year. And that confirmed in August, we did have a spike in the number of hot pixels, and confirming that this was very related to deforestation. We did a technical note on that. And in this technical note, basically, we compared the deforestation. We made a relationship. I mean, we investigated the relationship between deforestation, area deforested, and number of hot pixels, and it was a straight line. And then we included the number of days without rain, which is an indicator of how dry is that year. And in fact, we are not going through a major drought as we had in other periods. I guess Paulo maybe is going to talk about this. So this takes us to the point that, okay, deforestation is increasing a lot again in the Amazon, and maybe we'll be reaching the rates that we had in the beginning of, in the late 90s and beginning of 2000. And this is the point. I mean, this is what is a little bit scary, to come back to those, to that trend, then we get the rates of 20 years ago. Paulo?
I can't hear you, Dave, but I am assuming that you were asking me to say something about fires in Amazon.
Paulo, sorry about that. We didn't switch it over. Yes, so thank you so much, Ame, for that. And Paulo, if you could tell us, first of all, just briefly about your experience yesterday testifying to the Brazilian Congress, how that was received, and then about your fire research as well.
Yes, so before I talk about the testimony in Congress, I think it's good to go back about a couple months ago, actually, when we saw the first spikes in deforestation, as Annie mentioned. And there's a lot of confusion about those numbers because they were criticized by several parts of society. They were not necessarily measuring those deforestation rates. So the numbers were challenged. And the debate was not about whether Amazon deforestation was increasing, but whether the numbers were trustworthy. And fast forward a couple months, we started last month seeing these reports from partners from IPAM from scientists that probably fires this year, in 2019, were very high. And Annie and her team, together with several partners, put together an analysis that's very solid, showing what was actually happening. And what was actually happening was the result of the deforestation that started early in the year. So it was just piling up all this dead material, all these dead trees were being piling up in open fields. And then suddenly, people start burning, creating the biggest bonfire since 2009. So then the media got all the attention, and there's a lot of confusion what it was burning, for how long it was burning, the ecological impacts of these burns, and the responsibles for the fires that were seen in 2019. And then based on the reports, the analysis that IPAM and WHRC put together, then it became clear that the problem was with deforestation. It was the byproduct of deforestation, or the last step of deforestation. It was not related to a major drought in the Amazon, because if you look forest fires in the Amazon, fires burning live forests that are alive, they occur mostly in dry years, because tropical forests, healthy tropical forests, they are very, very resistant to fire. It's usually they create this microclimate that fires cannot move through the understory. So you have a very healthy forest in a non-drought year. It's very hard to burn a tropical forest alive. You have to cut down and dry it up and then burn as a bonfire, right? So IPAM showed that the problem was deforestation, was not climate. And I think because of that clarification in all the confusion that was being thrown in the debate, some initiatives in the parliament started to surge, and we needed to qualify the debate and clarify the policymakers, the deputies, Congress, and it was created a big coalition. They in Congress should discuss the Amazon, or sustainability of Amazon and forests. And then we had parts of the civil society, parts of scientists presenting data about what was happening in the Amazon, not only with regard to fires, but everything else. So, and the message when I went to Congress yesterday, it was to try to qualify that debate, to put some numbers on the debate that could lead to clarity and decisions that can move forward towards sustainability of the region. And pretty much that deforestation is driving a lot of the environmental issues in the Amazon. As Mike said, it's changing the regional climate, it's creating more flammable forests, because the edges of this forest with deforestation are very vulnerable to fires. And deforestation, usually the fires that are being seen in these deforestation areas, they may escape into primary forests. This year, if you had a major drought, it would be one of the worst firestorms in history, for sure, according to our models, right? We had a lot of source of ignitions in these open fields, but these fires are not escaping into primary forests and into healthy forests. In the future, this is very unlikely to happen. The Amazon is becoming, over time, more vulnerable to fire, more likely to burn, because of global climate change, because of deforestation changing the way the hydrological cycle works in the region, and because people are still using fire in the landscape a lot. So all this together is just increasing the flammability of the systems. And we are in a point that we have to remove the match, the fires that start these big forest fires. And we're doing the opposite. And I think this is one of the reasons that the entire world start paying attention to what is happening in the Amazon. Dave, we can't hear you. Yeah.
We can't hear you.
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great, great. I think I may mention that this is our inaugural Woods Hole Research Center webinar. So Thank you for bearing with our learning curve. So we got a couple questions queued up. The first one is for Dr. Ko. You talked about the cooling function of the rainforest. There's a lot of mention in the popular media about the Amazon rainforest as the lungs of the earth, but you don't like to use that term. How do you distinguish between those two?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the issue with the lungs of the earth is it's saying that the oxygen that the forests are creating is the important part here. It turns out that they really aren't creating oxygen. It's net zero. They're taking in CO2, they're putting out oxygen, and they're respiring. And the net effect is oxygen isn't being affected by forests. And by using that term, it's also takes away from the fact that what's really important here is carbon and the direct climate. Oh, louder? Yeah. It's really the climate and the carbon. It's the fact that they're storing carbon, they're keeping carbon, they're taking out it, and the fact that they're cooling the atmosphere that's really important here. I'm much more happy with talking about them being air conditioners. I think we should not think about them as lungs because it really does alter the understanding.
All right, we have a question for Paolo. Maybe a couple questions in a row for Paolo. The first refers to the CNN debate last night on climate change with the Democratic presidential candidate. And there was a discussion of engaging other countries in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, what role can the United States or other countries play in engaging the Brazilian government to reduce forest fires in the Amazon? And that's a question from David Dow. Thank you for submitting that.
I'm gonna give a very brief answer, and if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. So when you look at what is happening in Brazil right now, the Amazon is connected into the global market. What happens in the Amazon is influenced by buyers in China, in Europe, and even in the US. Brazil and US compete for the biggest market for soybean, for example. So if someone stops buying grains and soybean from the US, will impact what happens in the Amazon. So the same with Europe and China. So when you have these big international agreements, it's very important that there is some overseeing what's happening in the Amazon, at least a common agreement of sustainability across different nations and what is acceptable and what is not. Over time, Brazil's sustainability in the Amazon in the agribusiness sector has been increasing a lot over time. And so what is very important at the moment is just that the US and other countries make sure that they understand that there are great business people growing soybeans and cattle in Brazil from people stealing land and doing horrible things for the environment. And I think all these nations, Europe, the US, and even China, have the power to make it very clear and to create incentives for the people who are doing a good job in following the law, which is very difficult because very restrictive in Brazil. So the US put in some pressure for Brazil to follow the law and Brazil to differentiate who is doing the right thing and who is just committing a crime. It's very important because if you put these two groups to the same group, the same bag, we lose decades of environmental efforts and gains towards more sustainability in the Amazon.
Can I comment on that?
Yes, of course.
So just for you to have an idea, around 50% of our emissions, our Brazil national emissions, are directly related to deforestation, is land use change. So for us, I mean, and the other 20% is related to agriculture, which is already 4% is related to agriculture, which is already established, which means that around 74% is of our emissions are related with land use change in the rural areas or activities that occur in the rural areas of Brazil. So Brazil is the 7th emitter in the world, greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So for us internally, we have to do something. If you want to contribute with to mitigate global climate change, Brazil has to focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions that come from our rural area, which basically comes from deforestation. And also reduce greenhouse gas emissions that come from bad practices on agriculture production and cattle ranching production. So we need to invest in a more modern way of producing food, and also conservation strategies to keep our forests standing. And this is very important for Brazilians, and of course ends up being very important for the world as well. I think how Americans in general can help this process is actually asking from where your food is coming from. I mean, I think this engagement of the general public of if my food is coming from people that are like having good practices in the production or not. I mean, so I think this is a way to engage the society in one issue that is very important for them and for us as well.
All right, thank you so much. And there's a follow-up question from Scott Z. To achieve those goals that you were just describing, what's the role of policy in Brazil to address wildfires and to achieve the goals you were just talking about being so important?
No, just going to say that usually there are a couple ways, right? If you have a federal government with some policies that do not necessarily decrease deforestation, forest fires in the Amazon, there are several safety nets, right, in the society that can slow that down, at least turn the table. And in this case, it's a little bit about engaging the private sector that have been doing the right thing for a while. It is to create incentives to keep doing this. You have the civil society. The engagement is being blocked a little bit, but you still have the votes. You still have parts of the society engaging and turning and the table sometimes. And we also have the state governments, that many of which are committed to reduce deforestation and keep doing more sustainable practices.
Can I comment? Yesterday, we released another technical note, which basically focused on explaining or indicating where this fire is happening. I mean, which type of land tenure the fire is happening. And this brings us to gives us some hint on what we can do, I mean, as government, as Brazilian government, to actually inhibit this type of fires and illegal deforestation and illegal fires. So one number that calls our attention is that 1/3 of the forest of the fire pixels that we were computed in this period happened in areas that are like public lands, public forests that were not yet designated to a specific use or tenure. So those are like, I don't know how to call that in English, if you have that in the US, but some are government areas that were not designated yet. It could become a protected area or it could become a settlement area. But here in the Amazon, we have those areas, and this area is big. So which means that most of the deforestation, entirely the deforestation that is happening in this area is illegal. So people are going to these areas and establishing, cutting the trees, put them down to actually grab these areas. So this is like land grabbing, land speculation. So we can say that about 1/3 of the fires are related to land speculation and this process of expanding the agricultural frontier in like the Old West style. So this has to be tackled with police force. I mean, the government has to have a very strong pulse in terms of combating, like fighting this type of thing, because this should be, I mean, right away should be combated. The other thing is that, I mean, we need to have policies that give more incentive, as Paulo said, to producers in the Amazon to actually. I mean, you don't have. It's not necessary to expand to keep deforesting, to expand our production system. We have a very still very low, how can I say, density, head density of head cattle. So we have a very inefficient cattle ranch practice. And if we increase that by a little bit, for example, if you have half head per hectare in a pasture field, and if you increase that to 1 or 1.5 head, we will be having increase a lot of our production without having to expand this pasture field into the forest. And this has to be done with policies and to incentivize that.
A question from David Mahood asks about the relationship between these fires and indigenous protected areas, following on your point, Annie, about the protected areas. What's happening there, and are these areas a part of the solution?
For sure, the protected areas in the Amazon, which are about 50%, I guess, of our region, is under some type of protection. We have two main categories of protected areas in Brazil. One designated for indigenous territories, so indigenous communities live there, and they have the way of their livelihood systems, and which is very integrated with the natural resources and the forest as well. And also we have other types of protected areas, which we called conservation units, which are like you have like parks, extractive reserves, ecological stations. So those are like different categories. So these areas have been under attack lately, and those were a very important strategy used by the government to actually to inhibit land grabbing. So because when you go to a public land and you say, okay, this is going to be an indigenous territory, or this is going to be a national park, I mean, it doesn't matter. You don't have any incentive to invade this area and try to sell this area afterwards, because the land has no value. You won't get the title. So these areas, this type of conservation policy has been in the past very effective to reduce the pressure over the forest due to land speculation. Unfortunately, these areas have been under attack in this recent government due to, I mean, they have been questioned. And we are very worried about that, because a lot of communities live in these areas and they need to use the natural resources the way that they use. And they give a very important service. These areas as a whole give a very important service to the community, to the society as a whole. For example, Paulo will help me here with some In the south of the Amazon, we have an indigenous territory called the Xingu Indigenous Territory. And it's basically an island of forest in the middle of the deforestation area. Please correct me. There is a difference in temperature between this park and the area inside the park and outside the park of about 5 degrees, isn't it? In surface temperature, which indicates that this park has an ecological function there to help reduce the climate discomfort that is being generated in areas that are completely all deforested.
To 11:45 our time, because we're getting a flood of questions now. Thank you so much to everyone who's sending in questions. Mike, I'm going to pass this one over to you. It's a question from Alex Smith, and he asks, are you concerned the Amazon forest is reaching a tipping point? If so, how close are we, and what would that mean?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people are wondering. It's a tough one. I am concerned because what we are seeing is that the climate in the southern Amazon is becoming warmer and drier. That is less conducive to a rainforest. And for the reasons that have been pointed out, it's now more susceptible to fire. Once it burns, it's invaded by other things. So what I'm really concerned about is how that boundary between what is now a savanna and the rainforest will be changing the next decade or 2 decades. I think that we're going to see, we're already seeing that it's substantially warmer and drier in this region than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So, and that trajectory is not changing. Deforestation doesn't help it. It just makes it worse. So I am very concerned about this, where the this agricultural frontier and the remaining rainforest and how it will be altered in the coming decades. I'm less worried about the idea that the entire Amazon system would collapse at some point. I think that the planetary circulation that drives a very, very high rainfall rate of northwest of the Amazon is not likely to be affected in any near term, but that boundary area, maybe hundreds of kilometers, is at risk.
Thank you. It's possible we're getting more questions now that you can hear us. So I want to pass the same question over to our colleagues in Brazil. Do you have anything you want to add about the fears of a tipping point, your research on forest dieback?
Yeah, so this is a very, very, very important question, and I would say with our research that we don't know what the tipping point is. What we can say with all the research is that we are getting closer and closer to the tipping point. So some studies put the numbers in 40%, 20%, whatever the number is, may be getting closer to us because the pressure over this forest is just increasing over time. A couple of decades ago was mostly logging, and then came deforestation. Deforestation gained an area of over 760,000 square kilometers. So it's a gigantic area. And now we have an increase in temperature, we have shifts in precipitation, we have people removing more and more timber, you have people killing animals, which have an important effect on the dynamics of these forests. So it's just piling up lots of pressure on these forests. Now, whether it's self-collapse, I don't think it's going to happen suddenly, but it is going to be this massive process that is happening in the region, reducing the resilience of the system and the capacity to respond. These are very complex ecological questions. So putting a number is very difficult, but we can say that for sure that the probability of reaching a tipping point is getting closer and closer and closer by the decade, by the year, as we continue to put all this pressure over the systems.
So we have time for one more question. We have a number of questions we haven't answered. We will try to reach out and send these answers to you directly because they're great questions. We want to make sure that people get the information they're looking for. But this last question is kind of a broad-based. Justine asks, are there important updates on the status of the fires this week? Essentially, where are we? We've been hearing a lot from the news in the United States about these fires, but where do things stand now?
The fires, they continue because they are deforestation fires. So people already have cut out the forest in the past months, and the fires continue. They don't have the same spike that they had before, but they continue to increase. But now we have some policies. The government took action and actually prohibited fire use for the next 60 days, I guess, like 1 or 2 weeks ago, which helped to at least send a message to people out that the government will be watching that. And that was a very important message. Also, we have here that the police, that the army and the state government started also to act on the trying to like fight those fires, those big fires, and also to act in the root of the problem, which is deforestation. So, for example, I guess this week, the government of Pará, together with IBAMA and other agents of the federal police, went to a big, an area that was like 5,000 hectares that was deforested in the mid of Pará state. So they were all together there, and they just already started the process of judicialization of this. So, which I think is a very important message to give to the producers, because I mean, it's not that you have to, if you want to deforest, if you want to set fire, go and ask license for. I mean, some producers in the Amazon have the right, actually, they can, if they want, they can deforest and they can burn, but they have to ask for a license to do that. So it's very important that they do that. Yeah, basically that.
Just one point about what is happening, but it is in the next week and a half, we're going to see, or 2 weeks, whether fires are spreading into the forest, the standing forest and burning large forests, because this is the peak of the dry season in some parts of the Amazon.
What do you think we'll see? What's your prediction, Paulo?
Yeah, so my prediction is that, based on past studies, that these fires will escape mostly in degraded forests that are open by logging or opened by the boundary with agricultural fields. So the source changing a lot. Yeah, or that they were burned before. So that is mostly where the deforestation or the forest fires will happen. But of course, you have parts in Acre and some other regions that are becoming more susceptible to fire over time. So even in non-drought years, you may get some fires that are uncommon and larger than before. What is very key now is to reduce the source of ignition to fire, because there are many in the landscape still.
All right, I want to thank our panelists today. I want to thank everyone who tuned in to listen. We really appreciate you joining us today. We'll be sending some material out, including a recording of this presentation, so that you can go through it more carefully if you'd like. I also encourage you to visit our social media pages. We'll be posting links to the PBS NewsHour special that I mentioned that Dr. Coe is featured in, as well as a clip of Dr. Brando's testimony yesterday to the Brazilian Congress. Thank you, IPAM, for everything you're doing in Brazil, and we will be back soon, hopefully with another webinar on more Woods Hole Research Center science.
Thank you.
Thank you.